Good afternoon. Good afternoon, colleagues, guests. Welcome to meeting number 17 of the Special Committee on Electoral Reform. This is our last week in Ottawa before we start extensive travel across the country, visiting 10 provinces and 3 territories in about 3 weeks' time. In about 2 weeks' time, but 3 weeks' time for 3 weeks. We'll be traveling. So I'd like to introduce our guests. We have with us Dr. Broadbent, who really doesn't need an introduction, but I will give him a proper introduction all the same, because I think there's a number of things, details here that are very interesting and above what we already know of Mr. Broadbent as a political leader. He is a former member of the Royal Canadian Air Force. I didn't know that, actually. A former leader of the NDP, obviously, and the founder of the Broadbent Institute, obviously. Dr. Broadbent spent his early career as a university professor, that I knew, and since 1968 has devoted himself to a life of public service, among other things, serving as Member of Parliament for Oshawa-Whitby, as well as for Ottawa Centre. He was the Vice President of Socialist International from 1979 to 1989, as well as the Director of the International Centre for Human Rights and Democratic Development from 1990 to 96. In 1993, he was made an Officer of the Order of Canada and was promoted to Companion in 2001. Dr. Broadbent was a critic for democracy, parliamentary and electoral reform, corporate accountability, as well as for child poverty in the NDP Shadow Cabinet from 2004 to 2005. Mr. Charbonneau, bienvenue.
Mr. Charbonneau, welcome. I saw you a lot on television. You were a speaker at the National Assembly. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. I hope, Mr. Chair, that you're not too disappointed if you saw me on TV now that you see me in person. Jean-Pierre Charbonneau is a journalist and a former Quebec politician. He has worked at several media outlets in Montreal, including Le Devoir and La Presse, as well as at various radio stations and magazines. He was elected as a member of the National Assembly in 1976. Is that right? During his time in the public sector, he served as Speaker of the National Assembly of Quebec from 1996 to 2002, before being named Minister of State for Intergovernmental Affairs in Bernard Landry's cabinet, and later Minister for Reform of Democratic Institutions. In 2002, Mr. Charbonneau announced the creation of the Secrétariat à la Réforme des Institutions Démocratiques. He was also President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Francophonie and President of the Charles Bonenfant Foundation. Welcome, Mr. Charbonneau.
Oh, I presume it's from Toronto today?
No, I don't know.
No. Okay.
Wait, wait.
Well, I'd like to welcome Professor Yasmin Dawood. Can you hear us, Professor?
Yes, I can.
Good. Yasmin Dawood is an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, and this year was awarded the Canada Research Chair in Democracy, Constitutionalism, and Electoral Law. Dr. Dawood specializes in election law in Canada, the United States, and internationally, as well as comparative constitutional law and democratic theory. Her focus is broadly concerned with improving electoral integrity and democratic governance. Some of her recent articles have discussed the right to vote, money in politics, political dysfunction, partisanship, electoral redistricting, and the oversight of the democratic process by the courts. She is widely published in a variety of academic and law journals and reviews. Dr. Dawood also testified as an election law expert in the House of Commons Committee examining the Fair Elections Act, also known as Bill C-23, and is a frequent interviewee by various media on election law issues. So thank you to everyone for being here. The way we proceed is with presentations for 10 minutes by each witness, and then we have 2 rounds of questions. In each round, every MP gets to ask questions and obtain answers for 5 minutes. So the 5 minutes includes the answer as well as the question. Alors j'aimerais, sans plus tarder...
Without further ado, I would like to ask Mr. Broadbent to present his ideas on electoral reform. Mr. Broadbent, the floor is yours.
Permit me briefly at the outset to say one word about Maria Boulanger, and I want to explain why. It's particularly pertinent to this committee. I arrived from England on Friday evening to wake up Saturday morning to learn that my former colleague and friend had died and that there was a funeral that very morning. And I very much regret it that I was not here to be able to attend. The comment I would like to make is he was a minister in the minority government 2004 to 2006 for democratic institutions. And during that period, he was very accountable, very attentive to the equivalent of this committee that was meeting during that period. He listened to members from all parties. He was fully consultative. I worked very closely with him at that time, and he piloted through the Cabinet and then the House of Commons a report that came out of the committee and gave it his strong support. He was an immensely decent, thoughtful, good man, and he did superb work of the kind that everyone around this table is involved in. And I just wanted to say on this occasion, I think it's appropriate, given the nature of this work, that his fine work in the past be recognized. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for those insights and into the great work that Mr. Boulanger did. He was a model in many ways, and as you mentioned today, he's a model for us here who are studying electoral reform. So thank you for those kind words.
Mr. Chairman, I'll continue now. The members of the committee will have received a brief from the Broadbent Institute, and I don't intend to go over in detail everything that you will readily see in that. I will highlight a few points only that I think are important, and then I want to come to one particular issue that I do want to talk about that I think is important to all members of the committee, whatever their ideological orientation, whatever their partisanship, or whatever, but simply as members of Parliament. The first few points about support for proportional representation. As members of the committee will know, the large majority of experts, not only who have made their presentations to this committee, but around the world, those who have studied democracy and democratic institutions, when they make up their minds about electoral systems, the large majority come down on the side of some form of PR. It is also the case that the vast range of civil society organizations in Canada that have been involved with the Broadbent Institute, some 60 organizations from the YWCA to human rights organizations to trade unions, a great cross-section of Canadians have supported the, if I can put it this way, the principles that were found in the brief by the Broadbent Institute in support of proportional representation. 4 particular points why I think that it is by far, whatever the variety or type of PR it's used, by far to be preferred over the first past the post is first that every vote does indeed count. We do not get with the PR system what have appropriately been called false majorities that occur, whether it's with Mr. Trudeau in the most recent victory of some 39% of the vote resulted in a substantial majority of MPs, or before that in the election of Mr. Harper with roughly the same vote, 39% of the vote, and got more than a majority of MPs. So in 80% of the democracies in the OECD, more than 80%, that would be impossible. To get a majority government in most of the democracies, you have to have a majority vote. So the first thing to be said about the PR system is every vote does indeed count, and you don't get false majorities. Secondly, I would say that the first past the post system does distort both national and regional outcomes. For example, the Reform Party got in the 1997 election, if I recall correctly, 40 more seats than the Conservatives, even though they had roughly the same percentage of the vote in that election, but their vote happened to be concentrated exclusively in the Western Canada, and the Conservative Party vote was spread right across the country. So there was a distortion because of the first past the post system. Similarly, my colleagues in the Bloc, the Quebecois, may well remember this frequently. They got and won an election, indeed, 2/3 of the seats in the province of Quebec with less than 50% of the vote. And many Canadians across the country were unaware of the fact that a majority of Quebecers, in fact, voted for Federalist parties, but the governing group, the majoritarian group, was the Bloc Québécois. And once again, the electoral system distorted that kind of outcome. The third point I would make is that first past the post does discourage a number of people from voting for their first choice. A survey undertaken by the Broadbent Institute following the most recent federal election found that 46% of Canadians voted for a party that was not their first choice. I repeat that. In the most recent election, 46% of Canadians said they voted on their ballot for a party that was not their first choice in order to avoid electing, in their view, another party that was even less favorable to them. So the system does not encourage people to vote for their first choices. It encourages them to do strategic voting right off the top instead of getting their basic democratic wish. Finally, the point I would make in defense of PR, and it's a very important one to me, is almost without exception around the world where you have PR systems, you have more women elected. That is the other half in gender terms of the population for myself. And this is a very important consideration, I think, in a democracy. Canada ranks 62 in the world today, 62 in terms of percentage of women elected to our House of Commons. In New Zealand, when they introduced the system of PR, they went from having 21% in their House of Commons women. The first election with PR, they went up to 29% women, and the one after that, the most recent election, up to 31%. So the evidence is quite strong that if you have a PR system, you're bound to get more women elected than is the present case. Let me turn, Mr. Chairman, now the other point I want to make, and I can't elaborate because I want to go on, is that the PR system is conducive to more civility in politics. I have experience following my political life with, for example, German politicians in both the CDU and the SPD, and they both say, as people who are familiar with the Scandinavian situation, that in multi-party systems that are taken for granted, that you're going to have multi-parties forming governments, the politicians are more civil with each other before elections and during elections because they know they're going to have to work with somebody after. And that isn't a trivial point. The last speech I made in the House of Commons in 1989, I talked about the problem of civility. And it is a serious issue for democracy. And the fact that PR systems are not unequivocally clear on this, but tend to be historically more conducive to civilized debate is another, over the first past the post system, is another advantage. Let me come to the point I really want to mention today, because it has had relatively little attention, and that is sort of the national unity question. Whatever ideological persuasion members of around the table have, and there are differences, and there should be in democracy, or partisan differences, and they are real, and they should be in a democracy, all members of the Parliament, and with the possible exception of my colleague in the Bloc Québécois, which I respect but differ, all members, other Federalist members, have a pronounced commitment to the national unity of Canada and are very sensitive to policies that would be conducive to disrupting that unity. Now, my personal experience had shifted me away from strict PR, if I can put it that way, to favor a mixed system of PR and electing your own member was my conversation with the Prime Minister's father, the current Mr. Trudeau, in 1980, after the election, when he regained a majority, wanted me to come into the cabinet, even though he had a majority. Not only that, he wanted a number of my colleagues in the New Democratic Party to join with him in the cabinet. Now, why did he do this? Was not because he thought I was a splendid fellow or he was madly in love with the NDP, though there were obviously some policy overlap that's relevant to the proposition. His concern was, and it's an appropriate one, that he was going to bring in, he told me in private conversation at the time, what turned out to be the National Energy Program and the repatriation of the Constitution with a Charter of Rights. He knew in both these areas of policy I was in considerable agreement on much of it. Some of it turned out to be not the case. And he, and this is the point, notwithstanding the fact that he had a majority, he had 22% of the vote in BC but no seats, 22% of the vote in Alberta but no seats, 24% of the vote in Saskatchewan but no seats, 28% of the vote in Manitoba with 2. In short, he was bringing in a measure that was going to have a profound effect, particularly in Western Canada and the National Energy Program, but he had only 2 seats in all of Western Canada, notwithstanding a vote in excess of an average of 25%, only 2 seats, and he was concerned about this, as he ought to have been. Into all the details of that was a National Energy Program that was brought in that had an alienating effect, I speak bluntly, a good part of the program, not all of it, a good part of it on Western Canada. Objected to not only by a Conservative government in the province of Alberta, but by an NDP government in the province of Saskatchewan. The point I'm trying to make is through goodwill even, through goodwill, if you do not have in the cabinet people from different regions that are going to be making crucial policy affecting those regions, you can make serious mistakes. And the first-past-the-post system distorts the electoral system in Canada, and the 1980 election is a perfect example of that, how a majority government could be formed, and yet the Prime Minister of the day had to look elsewhere to other parties because he only had 2 seats, when if he had proportionality, he would have had many, many times that, and he would have had seats in Alberta, he would have had seats in Saskatchewan, he would have had seats virtually in all the Western provinces. So I take this, and this was a very serious impact on my personal thought about electoral systems. The first-past-the-post can have a negative effect on our national unity politics through no bad intention of prime ministers or opposition figures, just because of the results of the importance of having representation from all regions. Mr. Chairman, can I ask how much time is left?
Would you like another minute?
Okay. I think you're very generous.
Well.
But I'll conclude with this. I've mentioned the problem of 1980, and maybe we'll have another discussion about that. But then I could shift to the most recent election and ask you to look at Atlantic Canada. 32 seats, and they've all gone to the Liberal Party of Canada. If we had and this is not good, I would argue, for the Liberal Party of Canada. It's not good for Canada. If we had a proportional system, instead of being wiped out in Atlantic Canada, the Conservatives would have 6 seats, the NDP would have 6 seats, and the Green would have 1. And this would mean, as the Law Commission pointed out some years ago, that opposition parties need to be represented from all parts of the country as well if they want to know what they're talking about. One time I had to make, coming from a town called Oshawa, had to make a speech on the spur of the moment about something called the Atlantic fishery. Well, I knew that about as much as I know about walking on the moon. But all of you as MPs would have been in similar positions, I suspect. But the point I'm making is it's desirable for all parties, whether you're in the opposition or you're in the governing side, to have representation from regions. And a PR system really does that in a way that first-past-the-post does not. Well, I'll leave it, Mr. Chairman, at that. I thank you, and maybe we can have a discussion later.
Merci beaucoup, M. Broadbent. Merci d'avoir...
Thank you very much, Mr. Broadbent. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on the history of our political system from a slightly different point of view. Thank you for telling us about historic moments in our history. Now, Mr. Charbonneau, 10 minutes, please. Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen. After 25 years of the National Assembly, I have a tendency to call a committee a commission in French. That's what we call it in Quebec. I'm happy to be appearing with Mr. Broadbent today. I don't know if he remembers, but when I was working with Oxfam Quebec, I remember that we went to Honduras to oversee the elections there. And I fraternized with Mr. Broadbent at that time, and we hadn't discussed the issue, but I realized that we're really on the same page about it. So I have only 10 minutes. I'd like to start. Earlier, Mr. Cullen came to speak to me. He said, "You've been thinking about this for a long time." I said, "Yes." He asked me why it hasn't worked in Quebec. I said, because when our elected monarchs made that promise, they never kept the promise. In our political system, the Prime Minister wields enormous power. And if a party leader promises during the election campaign that they are going to change the electoral system, it all depends on that leader later on. It's the Prime Minister who chooses the minister responsible for the issue. In Quebec, we've been discussing this issue since 1909. There have been a number of election commitments. The PQ has made that commitment over and over. In 81, René Lévesque hoped that he would be able to implement a system of electoral reform, but unfortunately he was never able to. It was not until 2003, after a difficult experience for the Liberals in 98, where they became the official opposition, and Lucien Bouchard with the PQ managed to take power despite the fact that they had 36,000 less votes. So everyone in Quebec suddenly became interested in the issue again, and in 2003, the three party leaders once again made the same promise as what Justin Trudeau said recently. They said that it was the last time that they would use the old system. And now we're in 2016, nothing's changed in Quebec. Even though everything was done, there was a special parliamentary commission, there was a committee, there was there was a minister responsible for democratic reform. Everything was done, and yet after all that was done, Jean Charest decided that it would not be implemented. And today, in Quebec, the pretext is that we're waiting to see what Ottawa does in order to spur Quebec to further action. And all the parties in the National Assembly are interested in the matter, except for the governing party. I believe that we should move to a new system for the same reasons as those mentioned by Mr. Broadbent. In 1972, René Lévesque wrote that this is a democratically suspect system because it generates governments that have not been elected by the popular majority and that are distorted because we are no longer in a representative democracy. The representative character of our democracy is warped. Some parties are overrepresented, others are underrepresented, and some are not represented at all. A significant portion of the population within or outside Quebec are in favor of proportional representation. As Mr. Broadbent mentioned, we're generating a system of excessive confrontation. I could go on and on about the flaws in the current system, but I hope that those who have committed to changing the system are not studying this only to maintain the status quo. After making a commitment, One can't just abandon it. I'm sorry for being so frank, but I believe that if this promise is not kept, we'll be pulling the wool over the eyes of the population, particularly when the promise was made by party leaders or the Prime Minister. I believe that the mixed member proportional system is the best because in my opinion, it's the one that would meet the expectations of Quebecers and other Canadians the most. There would still be representation by various riding MPs, but there would also be fair and equitable representation. In April 2015, there was a symposium at the National Assembly organized by the Université de Laval in collaboration with the National Assembly. The CUP firm did a poll for the university. 70% of Quebecers believed that the system should be changed in order to ensure that political representation be fairer. Out of all the various electoral systems that have been proposed, studied, and imagined, this one has the advantage of leading to a transition. It would lead to a transition that would make it easier for the public to meet their two objectives: fair representation and also keep riding MPs representing individual ridings. Let me be frank. When I hear people saying that there would be two different levels of MPs with this system, I don't believe that's true at all. It's the same public that chooses representatives with two different systems, one that chooses representatives for the public and one for the parties. When an MP is currently chosen under the current system, what happens within caucuses and in Parliament is that these two categories are blended together. Each MP must represent both his or her party and the Canadian public. In my opinion, it's a straw man argument to say that there will be two separate categories of MPs. It's not a problem in the countries where the system has already been adopted. Why would it be a problem here when it's not a problem in New Zealand, Scotland, or Germany or elsewhere? We need to consider data and facts and not on abstract theorizing. One of the reasons that this change hasn't occurred in Quebec is that most members, including those who made commitments towards electoral change, were worried about losing their seat. And many MNAs, particularly those who hoped to form government, thought that they wouldn't be able to control the political agenda as they hoped. That is to say, a minority of members of government controlling the agenda. Because when there's a party that has majority control of Parliament, one can accelerate the process by muzzling MPs, passing omnibus bills, and using the parliamentary majority to muzzle Parliament and accelerate the processes, despite the fact that there's a complete lack of legitimacy to do so. And in Quebec, there's a third reason that the system was never changed. The Parti Québécois believed that it would lose control of the referendum issue. Since in the 90s, it took control with a minority of popular support. And that happened again later. But the Scottish situation has shown that that's not how it works. You can't become an independent country through an election. You need to do it through a referendum. You can manage to win elections, but if you can't manage to win a referendum, well, you can't become independent. So even for those who don't believe that Quebec should become independent, it's preferable to have a political mechanism that allows us to develop something very important, a culture of collaboration, cooperation, and compromise, and coalition. A coalition doesn't make government less stable. Again, I believe that that argument is not supported by the data in various countries with mixed member proportional compensatory systems. Making compromises with political opponents or with those who partially share our political ideology creates a political climate where the public can no longer put up with behavior which is overly antagonistic and which devalues the political process. Thank you, Mr. Charbonneau. Thank you for your very interesting presentation. You mentioned various very interesting points.
Now, please. Do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Okay, go ahead. The floor is yours for 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon. My remarks today will focus on the process of electoral reform in Canada, but I won't be speaking about the kind of electoral system that ought to be adopted. And these, my remarks today are drawn from an article entitled "The Process of Electoral Reform in Canada, Democratic and Constitutional Constraints." This article is forthcoming in the Supreme Court Law Review. So in the article, I considered a number of possible mechanisms for the process of electoral reform, including a citizens' assembly, a commission, a referendum, and an all-party parliamentary committee. And I did so by drawing on provincial and comparative international experience with electoral reform. So I looked briefly at electoral reform efforts in British Columbia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, Ontario, and Quebec, as well as electoral reform in France, Italy, New Zealand, Japan, and the United Kingdom. My main conclusion is that although no one process or mechanism is required for electoral reform, the process must be and must appear to be democratically legitimate. And to achieve democratic legitimacy, the process should visibly follow three norms. First, political neutrality or nonpartisanship. Second, consultation. And third, deliberation. Electoral reform differs from the passage of ordinary legislation because it sets out the very ground rules by which political power is attained. And so for this reason, the process of electoral reform must be held to a higher standard of democratic legitimacy. So let me talk about the first norm, political neutrality or nonpartisanship. This norm is important because it ensures that the process is as neutral as possible, which in turn helps to prevent the governing party from entrenching itself by selecting rules that favor it at the expense of the other political parties. This norm is also the most difficult to achieve, in large part because the choice of process can have a determinative impact on the kind of substantive reform that's ultimately adopted. So in other words, the choice of process can be as partisan as the choice of the electoral system, in the sense that a particular process could allow or could prevent a particular substantive outcome that is either favored or disfavored by any given political party. Any majority government in particular must guard against the perception of self-serving entrenchment by ensuring that the process is as nonpartisan as possible. As for the norms of consultation and deliberation, these norms ensure that the process has canvassed and considered in detail a wide array of opinions and options. Consultation is connected to the democratic ideal of participation, while the norm of deliberation requires that a collective decision should be justified by reasons that are generally convincing to all of those who are participating in the deliberation. Valid options should not be excluded without consideration, either directly or indirectly, by setting arbitrary goals and limits from the outset. So to further enhance democratic legitimacy and the norms of political neutrality, consultation, and deliberation, I would make 3 observations. First, that the proposed reform ought to have the support of all the political parties. In the event, though, that a consensus is impossible, it would be important for the proposed reform to secure the support of political parties that collectively achieved at least a majority and preferably a supermajority of the popular vote in the 2015 election. The composition of this Special Committee on Electoral Reform enhances the real and perceived legitimacy of any recommendations issued by the committee. But it would be equally important for there to be agreement among the parties at the legislative level to avoid the perception of partisan self-interest. Second, it would enhance the real and perceived democratic legitimacy of the process if an additional process option, such as a commission, citizens' assembly, or referendum, were implemented. While the town halls certainly add to the legitimacy of the process, they don't provide the kind of deep and detailed analysis of a commission, nor the more inclusive feedback of a referendum. That being said, I don't think that a referendum is required for the legitimacy of electoral reform, although it is, of course, one option as an additional process. However, it should be noted that a referendum is not necessarily a politically neutral choice. Based on the provincial experience with referenda on electoral reform, it is likely that a national referendum would fail, leaving the status quo first past the post electoral system in place to the advantage of the larger parties. A commission on electoral reform might be a better option as an additional process. Many recommendations from the 1989 Lortie Commission on Electoral Reform and Party Financing, for example, were used to revise electoral laws. But there are other smaller scale options for commissions. For example, New Brunswick and PEI each established an 8-person commission, and the PEI commission was composed in part by citizens. In Quebec, the Parliamentary Committee was assisted by an 8-person citizens committee. My third observation and recommendation is to extend the self-imposed deadline of December 1st, 2016. While this special committee has heard from a number of witnesses, and while MPs have organized a number of town halls on electoral reform, the timeline appears to be unnecessarily hasty, and it runs the risk of undermining the perceived legitimacy of the process. The deliberative and consultative processes should unfold over a longer time period to reflect the importance and scale of electoral reform, particularly in light of the fact that there is no additional process, such as a commission. My article also addresses the constitutional constraints on electoral reform, and while I cannot discuss this topic in any detail given time constraints, my conclusion is that electoral reform can likely proceed without a constitutional amendment involving provincial consent, provided that the reform is consistent with certain constitutional limits. And I'm happy to discuss the constitutional aspect should there be any questions on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dawood. So we'll start the first round with Mr. De Courcy for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to everyone here today for your commentary and testimony. I'd like to start, I think, with you, Dr. Broadbent, avec vous, Monsieur Charbonneau.
Then with you, Mr. Charbonneau, concerning the issue of local representation and the responsibility that an MP has to a local community, and what is the importance of this aspect in a system, any system, the current one, or your preferred choice? Mr. Broadbent can take that one first.
I have to say my experience as an MP influenced my judgment on this. Before I became an MP, 1955 was the first time I advocated proportional representation. A professor of mine gave me on my paper a comment, ingenious but ingenuous. But once I was elected, the point that you've raised became clear to me. I used to favor straight PR.
We hear, we're having trouble with the sound.
His mic is not on.
Oh, could you press the button on? Yeah. Should light up.
Okay.
We'll need to enter that joke into testimony.
Let there be light. Anyway, I think you can have a PR system that has members that can be quite responsive and constituents, citizens in an ordinary riding, broadly defined, could go to a variety of MPs that may be elected on a PR basis to work for them on practical problems that all MPs are confronted with. But on balance, I like the mixed proportional system, and I don't think it's an accident that New Zealand, for example, that had the Westminster model before, or Scotland, which experienced the Westminster model before, when they went to a new system, they tried to get the best of both worlds, if you like, to combine the PR with the local representation. And I think that's preferable. I think it is better to have, personally, a local MP who is directly elected, could be elected by a variety of forms, of first past the post, and then your second vote can be for the party of preference. But I think that direct contact with MPs is a desirable aspect of the Westminster model, if I can put it that way. I'll leave it at that.
Bien, écoutez, j'ai été député 25.
I was an MP, I was an MNA for 25 years under the current system, and I was both a parliamentarian and I was a citizens representative. If I had been in a proportional situation, a pure proportional situation, I think that I would have been an MNA who represented voters, who got interested in their issues and who did the work that needed to be done, and who also represented his political party. I don't think that because there are two types of MNAs or MPs, if we're talking about mixed proportional representation, that at the end of the day, elected officials will act differently. Some will have responsibilities that are different in their parliamentary teams, but at the end of the line, an MP and a mixed proportional representation, whether they're from a regional list or other, will work with his colleagues in the region and will work to represent the interests of his or her region in the same way that an MP in a riding will work on a smaller scale because the riding is smaller than the region that we mentioned, and they will also work to further the interests of their voters. It's as if we're trying to theoretically create a type of delusion that there would be two types of MPs because there would be different mechanisms for choosing them to ensure that political representation is fair and equitable. At the end of the day, what really counts? If we have a representative democracy, it means that representation must be proper, and there must not be under-representation that is, or over-representation that is unacceptable, or no representation. Once MPs are chosen under a system that has a better ability to represent the main ideas, the main parties, and so on, and main currents of thought, at the end of the day, the elected official does the work in the same way as others. There are not two ways to be a parliamentary representative. When we get up in the morning and we're talking about our regions, and as an MP, when I got up, sometimes I talk about my riding, and sometimes I would talk about my region, but mainly we talked about the main issues, which is also a type of. If the MP is a parliamentarian and also an intermediary between voters and Parliament, and Mr. Charbonneau, but I wouldn't have not done this work if I had been a list candidate. I'm sorry. That's okay. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I wasn't looking at you. It's okay. I would highlight that normally the microphones are controlled remotely, and we don't have to push on the microphones, but apparently it's not working today, so everyone needs to turn on their own microphone when they wish to speak. So now we'll move on to Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's now 12 years ago that I served on a parliamentary committee that dealt with the issue of electoral reform, and Ed Broadbent was on that committee at the same time, it's good to be discussing the same issue with you again after all these years. Or perhaps it's bad to be discussing it for all these years because it suggests an unresolved
I hope your
question.
views have changed since then.
Well, my view at the time, I was actually going to ask you that very question because my view at the time, and you'll recall this from the report, the supplementary report written by the Conservative Party, which was largely penned by myself, that we said that no system of electoral reform should be adopted, no new system without a referendum to authorize it. That's a view I still hold. At that time, you indicated on a number of occasions that you had at least a somewhat complimentary opinion and felt that a referendum would be a legitimizing tool. I'm wondering if you still feel the same way or if you feel that it is not necessary to have a referendum today. So let me start with that.
Well, I can see the argument for it, but on balance, I think the arguments against it are better, frankly. Beginning from the constitutional position, it certainly isn't constitutionally required to have a referendum. Secondly, I agree with our distinguished academic from Toronto, who, in terms of some of the conditions she laid out, that if, for example, more than one party campaign, which was the case for this Parliament, not only the Liberal Party, but the New Democratic Party of Canada and the Green Party all campaigned on the basis of committing themselves to some form of electoral reform. And that, for me, gives solid democratic legitimacy to the project. Parliamentary democracy entails the view that not direct citizen participation, but representative participation. So if we have more than one party, and I strongly agree with that, it'd be a fundamental mistake for the governing party alone to bring in a system that it alone favored. That would not be legitimate in a democracy, as has already been suggested by my academic colleague as well.
If I might say so,
Yes.
Here's the problem that one has with, there are a number of problems that I believe, but one problem is this. As you would know very well, the phrasing of that Liberal election promise, this will be the last election conducted under first past the post, was taken word for word from an NDP Opposition Day motion from December 2014. The NDP motion goes on to specifically mention proportional representation. It may even say MMP. I can't remember now. It did. Okay, so the NDP voted for it. So I think anybody voting NDP knew they were voting for MMP. The Liberals voted against that motion in 2014. And so the result is that people voting Liberal would have, to the extent they had thought this through, and I suspect most people did not know various voting patterns, but they would not have said, I'm voting for MMP. So there's a multiplicity of potential changes to the system, none of which has actually been approved by the voters in that election. And that, I think, is a fundamental problem that remains. There's no specific system, but we would have a specific change, which might or might not actually have the approval of voters. It is not difficult to imagine a system better than first past the post, but it's also not difficult to imagine an electoral system being put before Parliament, which would, from the point of view of the Canadian voters, be worse than the current system. And that is the purpose of what a referendum does. It prevents that option from occurring. So do you think that I am wrong in what I say in this regard?
Well, I'm saying that however the Liberal Party voted on that motion, frankly, I was not familiar with that, but they had a campaign after that in any case, and the man who became Prime Minister did make a campaign for electoral reform, and with many options open, as I recalled. But he also, again, if I recall, used the phrase, every vote must count, make every vote count. And if you do that, there's only one system, frankly, that does that. It was a system of PR of some kind. Mm-hmm. So I think there would be legitimacy for the Liberals to say they campaigned on that, as there would be for the Green and the NDP. Let me add further, and if you have the deliberative process, and I agree with what our academic colleague has said about the importance of the deliberative process of this committee and its important work to give legitimacy as well. I want to raise one negative thing about referendums. If we have all the positive conditions of deliberation, more than one party, campaign commitments, then I ask members of the committee to think if the country went ahead with a referendum, I lived through, in part, what happened in England on the Brexit vote. And I can tell you that it's a hopelessly divided country right now, very seriously. And what would happen in Canada, whether we win, whether a referendum question won or lost, and Quebec and Alberta voted one way, but the rest of the country voted another way. Or British Columbia and Quebec voted one way, and other provinces voted another way. And the votes were, and the campaigns were rather intense, and the divisions were rather intense. My own serious view about this is that this would contribute to national disunity, not unity, whether the campaign was won or lost. There could be great divisions. Now, if it were the only option, I say to the honourable member, because I take seriously the argument for a referendum, even though I don't agree, if all the other conditions of deliberation and campaign promises were met, then I think the parliamentary system making a decision on its own is legitimate. If I could add one final point, the two great political theorists of the late 18th century and early 19th, one a liberal and one a conservative, Edmund Burke and John Stuart Mill, would have both favored parliamentary action in a case like this.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Boulis.
Merci, Monsieur le.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witnesses who are here with us today and who had very interesting comments to make. Thank you particularly, Mr. Broadbent. I was not fully aware of the 1980 election. I have vague memories of it, but the fact that we could have a situation where 25% of people voted for the Liberal Party in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and they could come up with public policies that are effective and that represent different regions and citizens. I would like to hear you more particularly on the fact that you know very well the different methods of voting. You have traveled, you have looked at what is going on elsewhere. You noted that 80% of countries in the OECD have proportional voting systems, either compensatory or mixed. In your opinion, do the citizens of those countries understand fully their electoral system and their voting system? And does that encourage them to be more engaged in the political process than in the system that we have here currently in Canada?
Subjective opinions, as the honourable member will recognize, but both my general experience in reading about these countries, but more specifically talking to members of parliament, especially when I had a position in the Socialist International. It brought me into contact with members of all parties in European assemblies, and I've never had any question, and because at that time I was asking personal questions myself, because I was in favor of change here, and whether they were on the Conservative Party, say in Germany, in the CDU, or the Social Democrats, I found broad agreement that they're very happy with their system, and certainly no suggestion that their citizens lacked an understanding. I mean, in the case of a straight PR vote, of course, you just vote for your party and that's it, or a list system. In the case of Germany or Scotland or New Zealand, you have two votes, but they're pretty straightforward. You vote once for your local MP, and your second vote is for your party of preference. And I never ran into anyone suggesting that this was too complex for ordinary people to handle. Quite the contrary, they were quite at ease and accepting of their system.
Merci, Monsieur Broadbent. Monsieur Charbonneau, vous avez.
Thank you, Mr. Broadbent. Mr. Charbonneau, you have the Quebec experience in an attempt to reform the voting system. So you saw a number of obstacles and difficulties that arose with voters and some resistance among rural areas and certain regions. In your opinion, what are the obstacles that we will face as a parliamentary committee at the federal level, and what potential solutions could you propose to overcome this resistance to change? First of all, when the parliamentary committee started in Quebec a few years ago on the preliminary bill, the minister who was holding down the fort had to continue to do so. If you don't make changes when you propose it, there's a problem. And for example, when the representatives of the regions in Quebec came before the parliamentary committee, they said, listen, well, it will be terrible, we will lose power and the representation of our regions. Nobody provided a response to that. Well, the answer was very easy. Take an example like Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean or West Island on Montreal Island, where there is in general a fairly homogeneous representation. If there had been a mixed proportional or compensatory system, there would have been a plurality. There would have been different kinds of representation. And what would that have given in terms of power of the region and representation of the interests in the region? It would force MPs from all parties in the region to form a coalition for the interests of the region. For example, if there were a large economic project in Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, everyone would work for the project and not just the MPs for the party in power, which has a majority of MPs. So unlike what people feared, I think on the contrary, it will strengthen the power of regional representation because it will create a dynamic of collaboration that currently does not exist. Thank you.
Oui, bonjour. Alors, Madame, Messieurs, merci.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to speak to us this afternoon and to share your wisdom on the issue. In Quebec, we have a shared language that is different from the other provinces. We have our own culture and our own artists, our own references, our own media. We subscribe to different websites than others. I know it. I know this well. And we don't have the same debates. We don't have the same priorities and values. My concerns is to ensure that in the Canadian Parliament and the House of Commons, well, Quebec was recognized as a distinct nation, and it needs to ensure that the reform will respect that. So we need to make a legislative union. We need to create mechanisms to ensure, for example, that the Quebec nation is recognized and protected. When I see, for example, the proportional compensatory mix system, well, if we have a list across Canada, we have to ensure that it isn't established in Toronto and that the Quebec list serves values that are not our own. Mr. Broadbent and Madame Dawood and Mr. Charbonneau, how would you ensure that there are mechanisms that protect our nation? Well, first of all, you would need to have a regional mixed proportional representation. So when you talk about region, I mean the main federal states and a grouping of federal states. For example, Quebec would be one region, and within Quebec there could also be sub-regions. There wouldn't be just one riding in Quebec. There could be, as proposed at the National Assembly, there could be sub-regions, which would mean that there would be the possibility of having representatives who represent the region, but the voting system is not the only thing that will help the Quebec nation distinguish itself. There might be more Bloc MPs or more MPs for Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who had 73 or 74 or 75 MPs, and that gave the impression that he had risen to power in Quebec. This is a distortion of the reality. If we want to protect the Quebec nation, it is not necessarily through the voting system at the House of Commons that we will do so. It is through other mechanisms, including, well, the Parliament in Quebec needs to do its job. There is no Canadian list. That is clear because at that point, you're no longer talking about regional compensatory, you're talking about national compensation. And there is a huge country like Canada cannot think that there would be one national list. No one, in my opinion, would support that for very long. I am in agreement with my friend, Ms. Daywood. I will just interrupt for a moment. You will not lose time. Apparently, there's an adjustment to be made so that we can fix the problem. We will suspend for 2 minutes to fix the technical problem so that we can hear Ms. Dawood properly. So we will suspend very briefly. You will not lose your time. I'm timing it here.
Yeah.
Do it now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect, fantastic. Okay, alors, monsieur...
Please go on, Mr. Saint-Marie. So, Mr. Charbonneau and Mr. Broadbent told me what they thought about the issue, and now I'd like to ask Ms. Dawood, would you believe we should have a pan-Canadian list, or should we have a provincial one to protect the minority nations within Canada?
With the process of electoral reform, rather than commenting on the specific substance of various proposals, but I will say in answer to your question that this is one reason why having an in-depth process is really important, precisely to get issues like the one you raised fully vetted before any system is chosen or any recommendations are made.
Merci. J'avais plein d'autres questions, mais là, la pause là, m'les a fait perdre, mais je voudrais...
I had several other questions, but they've slipped my mind. But could you tell me whether you believe that beyond reforming the electoral system, you believe we should also reform the party funding system? Do you think we should reform that system to give parties the same chances Well, let's not get things mixed up. Those are two different portfolios. But very quickly, sorry, Mr. Chair, when it comes to the referendum, I didn't have a chance to mention it earlier. When it comes to the referendum, the best thing would be for the committee here to complete its study and propose a solution to Canadians after having studied the matter in depth. That way, Canadians, after 2 general elections, could get a chance to test the new system. In New Zealand, they started with a referendum, but considering the size of New Zealand, well, it's not nearly as big as Canada, so that's quite different.
Je veux commencer avec un grand merci à tous.
I'd like to start by thanking all the witnesses today.
To Mr. Broadbent, and I can't begin by failing to thank you for your service to Canada, sir, and for being here today. We had testimony, I'll just reprise this because it came to me when I was reading your evidence about what's good for parties, and then you had another comment about this would be good for voters. And that difference came up in Professor Pippa Norris, who was testifying to us. She testified, she's at Harvard right now. She said, if you in choosing the values, because we're now realizing it's a question of values, what do you value when choosing electoral system? She said, if your value is to help larger political parties, then you like first past the post. But if your value is to privilege how voters feel about the effectiveness of their vote, then you move to proportional representation. I wonder whether, Mr. Broadbent, you have a sense of what we should focus on. Obviously, you want proportional representation. You prefer a mixed member system. How do you see teasing out that difference between what works for voters and what works for parties?
Well, as Mr. Charbonneau has mentioned, and I've experienced it very often when politicians on electoral systems find that they get elected by first past the post, they conveniently forget about any commitment they might have made to an alternative system. And it's very tempting, I think, for anyone who pursues power and wins it by one method is unlikely to want to change it to another. And I'll be quite candid here. I was quite delighted with Mr. Trudeau's campaign. It's the first prime minister in history, first prime minister who said that he would bring in change to get rid of first past the post. So I for one, have taken that commitment very seriously, and I think it was a commendable promise. But that cuts into what you're saying, Ms. May, it seems to me, because that is implicitly says I'm more, because the first past the post is the most reliable system to maintain power, and implicitly saying, well, I'm prepared to adopt a system that may not work for my power interests. And particularly, as I said very briefly in my comments, the value of making a positive vote for me in a democracy is very important. Not to vote, as I said, a survey we did after the last election, a very high percentage of Canadians voted for a party of their second choice to avoid electing someone else. And that doesn't maximize the value of participation. And that's why a PR system or a mixed system was much better in terms of meeting the value needs of individual citizens.
Thank you. I want to turn to Professor Dawood. I also had the benefit of looking at your 2012 paper at University of Toronto Law Journal, in which the term partisan self-dealing is used quite a lot. It was a new term for me, and I think you've reflected on the legitimacy of the process as being essential, that the composition of this committee aids in the legitimacy of electoral reform. But I want to put to you a different proposition and see if you would agree that the legitimacy of our process of electoral reform is also connected to the extent to which the governing party appeals to be dealing against self-interest. And this is picking up on the point Mr. Broadbent just made. And it's sort of in legal terms, an evidentiary weight is given to a statement against self-interest. I know your paper is already written and in press, but do you think there's any additional legitimacy to be gained by knowing that the party in power is doing something unprecedented in opting for a system that may not benefit them?
Well, absolutely, because it rebuts the worry or the presumption that partisan self-interest is the only motivation for a particular proposal for reform. And so if the governing party selects a reform option that is not optimal for that party's political success in a future election, then that would be certainly, I think, viewed from a legitimacy perspective as being a more principled decision than a decision that was clearly self-interested in the sense that it would enhance the governing party's political success in a future election. So yes, that is to make a disinterested selection, I think, would add to the legitimacy of any proposal by a governing majority, which is why it is so important to make sure that the process is in fact both fair and perceived to be fair, because you don't want a situation in which successive majorities cherry pick rules that help them, and then the next majority comes along and picks its own set of reforms that it can push through because it has a majority power in Parliament.
Thank you. Ms. Sahota.
I'd like to begin by thanking all the witnesses for your valuable time and imparting your wisdom on us. I agree with you that I think this has been a very, a good step that our Prime Minister has taken, a very ambitious goal, and I know the Minister is committed to making a change in electoral reform. I hope that we can come to some kind of consensus agreement amongst this committee and, a majority, as Ms. Daywood has stated, or at least a majority in the legislative process to support any kind of change. But if as you were just stating before, if that was not to happen, are there any constitutional issues that you see, Ms. Daywood, in moving forward with electoral reform without that?
So the constitutional question is a somewhat complex one. I don't know how much time or interest there is in all the details, but I will say that until the Supreme Court's Senate reference decision, it seemed pretty clear that Parliament could actually make electoral reform decisions or changes to election laws, provided that it went through the normal parliamentary process. So the court, in many of its cases, has said that the electoral system falls within the domain of Parliament. The court has recognized a number of constitutional limits on what Parliament can do. These tend to center around the right to vote as protected by Section 3 of the Charter. There also are distributional requirements in Section 51A of the Constitution Act. But apart from those types of restrictions, it would have seemed before the Senate reference decision that Parliament would be able to bring about electoral reform. But as you know, in the Senate reference decision, the court said that various proposals to reform the Senate did in fact amount to a constitutional amendment, even though they didn't actually envision any changes to the constitutional text. So, for example, the consultative elections, which were the proposal was that these would take place without actually changing any of the language of the Constitution, but the court nonetheless found that this amounted to a constitutional amendment. So the point being that the question now is, if you have electoral reform, is this the kind of amendment to the Constitution that would in fact require provincial consent according to the 750 rule, where 7 provinces that have 50% or more of the population agree to the change? So what I did in my paper that I was describing is to try and figure out if there's a way around this. Is there a way for a future court decision to actually say, no, in fact, electoral reform does not need to be approved via a constitutional amendment involving provincial consent? And in my opinion, there is an argument for that. There is also the argument on the other side that, in fact, a constitutional amendment involving provincial consent is required. Did that answer the question?
Well, it leads to many more questions, actually. And I did see some nodding from some of our other witnesses. So if there is something that you'd like to add, or if you agree or disagree with that statement.
Moi, je ne pense pas, Madame, que...
I do not believe that the Constitution has anything to do with the electoral system. The important thing is to respect democracy. That is to say, the parliamentary majority. But in this case, given that we are debating the level of representativeness of the system, we also need to ensure that there's a popular majority. So, for example, if Parliament decides to pass a bill, we need a majority of MPs, of course, but those MPs need to represent a majority of the population. I believe that politicians should consider doing the same thing as New Zealand, including a mechanism to state that after 2 general elections, there would be a validation period. That would allow Canadians to experiment with the system and understand it better than during a referendum debate. If the referendum has several choices, it's really very complex. That's a lot more complex than deciding whether Quebec should be independent or not.
Appreciate you all being here today. I'll start, and I was suspecting this round probably likely finish, I suppose, with Mr. Broadbent. I've got a couple of questions, at least, for you. And I first want to say, great respect for your long and distinguished history as a parliamentarian, and I've got one question that might be seen as a little bit tougher to someone that doesn't have the experience that you do, but I know you won't take it in any way personally, or that you won't see that you've
I can hardly
great
wait
experience in to and fro. Yeah, and I'm sure you'll have no trouble handling it. But it's this, that I felt like I heard maybe a bit of a contradiction to some of your previous thoughts and statements when you were responding to Mr. Reid's question earlier, and so I wanted to ask you about that and explore that a little bit, if you don't mind. And when you spoke to the public roundtable on proportional representation that was organized by the New Brunswick Commission, I think that was in 2004, I believe. You made a quote that started with that you generally weren't a fan of referendums, that you felt that, and I quote here, when restricted to establishing the democratic rules of the electoral system applicable equally to all citizens, and when the question is preceded by a thoroughly deliberative process involving the citizens themselves, it seems to me that such a referendum fully measures up to the democratic aspirations and values of classical democratic theorists like John Stuart Mill. So it seems to me like at that point in time you were sort of indicating that a referendum was something that maybe on this type of a question would be something that you would certainly be in favor of, and I sense a different viewpoint today. So I'm wondering if you could kind of explain that to us a little bit. It seemed like you agreed with the idea of a referendum when you were working to convince Canadians to proceed with electoral reform and consider electoral reform, but now that we're sort of having that serious discussion about electoral reform, it seems like maybe you don't share that view any longer, and I'm having trouble understanding and reconciling that. So if you could try to explain for me.
Mr. Chairman, to my colleague, if I can put it that way, like everyone around this table, I change my mind occasionally, right? And if you look with care, I think, in what I had said then, it was a democratic option to proceed with a referendum, which I could understand and could see people going from that to endorsing the idea. But I have thought more about it since, particularly, the legitimacy argument I'm quite convinced that, as I won't repeat, the steps can be taken that don't necessitate going directly to the people. But the other divisive aspect, I must frankly say, in my experience in watching in the UK, the divisive impact of a referendum, and the experience, reflecting on the experience in Canada as well of referendums, I think in a regionally diverse country like ours, whether win or lose the referendum, as I said in my opening comment, I think it would end up being much more divisive than if you have the kind of deliberative process and all members of this committee act in good faith, try to think through all the options and come up with a recommendation. I think that's much more likely to build a consensus, frankly, in the country than a referendum.
Fair enough.
So.
We'll have to agree to disagree on that one.
Okay.
I guess it's easier for you to change your mind at this point in time than it is for some of the ones of us around the table that are currently still in the game. So I can appreciate that. We don't have a lot of time left, but I guess I'll move to a different topic. And I know in the past you've also spoken out against the idea of ranked ballots. And I'm wondering if you could tell us if that's a view that you still hold, and if so, could you give us sort of some rationale for the basis for that opinion?
Yeah, well, it's a matter of preferring the system that I did advocate. It's either strict PR or MMP, and a ranked ballot system can have the effect of eliminating particularly very small parties. They can be ranked out of the system, and the advantage of either MMP or strict PR is that every vote will count, and you don't need to have a ranking to make that count. So I just prefer it without. That's all.
Thank you. I suspect not much
You have time for a short snapper, as they say.
Okay. Well, it's okay. I'll save it for the next round.
Okay, that's good.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Aldag, please, for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you. I'm going to direct my comments and questions to our two in-person panelists or witnesses to start. Over the last couple of weeks, I've had the opportunity at home to do a couple of town halls on electoral reform. And the most recent was this past Saturday. It was put on by Fair Vote Canada and a neighboring riding association from the Liberal Party. And at the first one that I'd put on that I had organized, I had a number of constituents come out, including a number of self-proclaimed conservatives who were very effective in addressing their concerns for referendum. I would say on the session we did on Saturday, there were many of the same faces there. And although I wouldn't consider it a breakthrough, I found it quite exciting because we were able to move from that position into some more discussion about values. And I found it quite exciting that because the question I put to the audience was, what values should we be looking at to design a new system? And so from a range of participants, including, like I say, some of the Conservative members and others who were there, we started talking about what things they would like to see guiding the design of a new system. And so there was a document that I had found, the Canadian Electoral Reform, Public Opinion and Possible Alternatives from the Broadbent Institute. And there's a good section here on values, and a couple of them were things like the ballot is simple and easy to understand. And that got 55% of support, and then 51% went to the system produces stable and strong governments. Over the discussion this weekend, those were a couple of the issues that came out from a broad variety of participants. And I just wanted to, and I'm not picking holes into any particular system, but it's like, those ones also raise questions about systems such as PR, the idea of coalition governments, and can they actually produce stable and strong governments? Are the two actually, do they work against each other? Or the ballot's simple and easy to understand. At my first town hall, there was a gentleman brought a German ballot that was like 3 feet by 3 feet, and people remembered that one, and they were concerned that any PR system ballot is going to be really complex. And I simply throw it out for comment about, how do we address system or these kind of issues, and how do we frame the discussion on values that will help us come up with a system that is really the best option for Canada at this point, that's designed for Canadians. There's not really a question there, but just thoughts on values and criticisms that we hear, and how do we address that?
Mais dans votre mandat, Monsieur le député.
In your mandate, Mr. Aldag, in the committee's mandate, already you have a certain number of principles and values that are stated from which upon which you must reflect and evaluate the different options. I think that it is a basic guide to know whether, for example, do we give importance to fair representation of the main political currents in our society, underrepresentation, overrepresentation, no representation. Does that concern you? You must also be concerned about the stability of governments. But how do you demonstrate that these governments aren't stable if there are different types of government and they have to work together in a coalition? The only thing that you can do is, 1, do it, and 2, look at what's been done elsewhere. Otherwise, it's just fear guiding you. And they're justifying the fact that people don't want to have elections regularly every week, and they're taking the worst examples, like Italy and Israel, to say that that's terrifying. But when you take those examples out, and they're not relevant to the choice that will apply here, it changes things a lot. And there is one element that I learned about recently. Well, and the rest, I learned recently. There were experts welcomed over last spring. I'm a special advisor for this movement, and I learned that there was a mechanism in a certain number of countries that was established, a parliamentary mechanism to ensure the stability of coalitions, and it's called a constructive confidence vote. And it was initiated by Western Germany, which has the perfect compensatory value because it's 50-50. Half of the MPs are voted for under the current system and half are in a proportional government. So if a government wants to be defeated, and if you're part of a coalition, there must be an alternative proposed. So if there's a government that is able to create a new parliamentary majority, so it remains with the commitments that it made and the political agreement that was made to form the coalition. Nothing would prevent us from establishing that mechanism. So in other words, there are means to ensure that we can not only go where we need to go, but also innovate to ensure that we don't have unstable governments, that we don't find ourselves in situations, for example, there could be a threshold. The threshold could be 3%, 5%, 6%. There are instruments to guarantee based on the principles, and if you don't have principles from the get-go, then I think that your hands are tied to make political choices. Thank you very much. We're moving on to...
You could make the point, Mr. Broadbent. This is hard, you know, when we have two eminent...
No, I understand. No, I understand. It's all right.
It's hard on us here. Hard on me to limit the time when we have such wisdom at the committee here. Mr. Cullen.
Thank you. This is great. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm also enjoying this. I wonder if we've come to a bit of a political tipping point in this country. I'm thinking of you, Ed, standing with Guy Giorno and Mr. Himmelfarb, and reading quotes from Jason Kenney talking about our system being medieval, reading the minister's quote about how our system was designed to address 19th century reality and is not suitable for the needs of a 21st century Canada. That is there a multi-partisan point of which we've crossed, Parti Québécois and Bloc Québécois and various people speaking out for proportional systems. One quick comment to follow that, and then a question for you, Mr. Broadbent. With regards to stability, we've heard evidence that in the last 55 years in developed countries, it's been almost equal between proportional and first-past-the-post countries in terms of stability. In fact, proportional ones slightly more stable. So there's these notions of unstable coalitions, and that in Canada's history, when parties have had to share power, we've produced our most progressive and enduring policies, pensions, healthcare, the flag, and the list goes on, have all come out when parties have had to put a little water in their wine. I want a question about this positive vote, a positive choice, when voters walk into the ballot box and don't have to go down this list of negative options. Well, I really don't like that person or that party or that leader. Which is the best choice for me to disrupt them, as opposed to what do I want? I'm imagining someone going and buying a cell phone and the store says, there's all these choices, but you only get 2 in your particular city. So pick up these 2, and the rest you can't have. The store wouldn't last long. And I don't know why we continue with these false choices. I want to get back to your 46% voted not for their first choice in the last election. What do you think the long-term effect has been for Canada in terms of voter enthusiasm, in terms of hopefulness, in terms of the way parties respond and create platforms for voters under that scenario?
Well, as you will recognize, this again is quite a subjective answer on my part. It's a judgment call. It's not based on any, as one would say, solid empirical evidence. But I think, having said that, it's almost self-evident that part of the cynicism of youth, and not just youth, about the electoral system it has to be related to this. That if you live in a certain constituency and you know it's always going to vote one way, and no matter, even if there's 20% in that riding that want to vote another way, this can be, and the vote's not going to be counted on the first past the post, this can be a major disincentive to even participate, and can build at the most exaggerated levels, I guess, a degree of cynicism. So that's why I'm strongly in favor of changing the system, is to avoid this necessity of, having to vote in a way to stop somebody else. In other words, to vote for your second choice because you think that second choice can beat this third option you don't like. And we should have a system that encourages, whether young people or not so young people, to vote for positive reasons. And I think only some version of PR does that.
Speak as well to women getting elected.
Oh, indeed.
To serve in the House. There was a study of 60 years worth of elections in Australia and showed that the two houses, which used two different systems, one AV, a ranked ballot type of first past the post, and the other using a proportional system, women were 2.5 times more likely to get voted in under a proportional system.
Yeah, if I may comment on that, on the one hand, again, I'll praise our present Prime Minister for doing the gender equality thing in the cabinet, but I have to be candid. When that happened, I thought of Gro Brundtland, Prime Minister of Norway, did it decades ago in Norway. And I remember having a lunch with her in the parliamentary restaurant here after she came here from winning an election, and told me then, many, many, many years ago, they had parity, gender parity in Norway. And I don't think it's an accident that they had a PR system as well.
But to be content with being 62nd in the world in terms of gender women representation in Parliament, it was not. I think it's a stat that's shocking to most Canadians if they knew that. We think of ourselves better than that and more fair than that. Yet our system isn't serving us right now. Mr. Charbonneau, vous avez mentionné une option.
Mr. Charbonneau, you mentioned an option of a vote after the system has been in place for a few years, several elections perhaps. Why did you mention this option? Very briefly, please, Mr. Charbonneau. Because my experience is based on the one experienced in New Zealand. The advantage is to allow voters to experience a political mechanism that is relatively complex depending on the choice you make. And from the moment that voters experience this, they appropriate it for themselves, and unless there are new voters who didn't know the system, it allows them to draw comparisons. So if I had a referendum and then a referendum on ratification later, it's easier for people to make an enlightened decision. Otherwise, it's the leadership responsibility of the elected officials to assume the responsibility. Mr. Reyes. Thank you to our three witnesses. Mr. Charbonneau, I would allow you to continue on that theme because my question is going a bit in the same direction. This is my first day here with the committee. I arrived for my riding. It's summertime, and I can tell you that no one has been talking to me about electoral reform. I hear a lot of discussions going on, and I often hear cases of examples where they changed the system from first past the post to mixed member proportional. You mentioned New Zealand. You said that it took time to reflect upon that, and it was 10 years of reflection to make the change. And when we look at the results following the change, it gives me the impression that it was sort of a false start that we're doing right now. By changing the voting system, there are more people who will be interested in politics and more people who will go vote, and our voter turnout rate may increase. And when you look at countries that changed recently, that is not what happened, except for the recent, they went from 85% to 88% in New Zealand, and in the last election, it was at 76.9% of people who voted. So despite the change, despite this impression that's given that people are more interested, when you look at the studies of voter disinterest, people are not interested, they don't have time, and people don't turn out to vote at the voting station. So I would like to know a little bit more about your thoughts on the matter of this example in New Zealand, because, listen, you just said that people aren't taking buses to talk about electoral reform. That's true everywhere. That's an argument that I've heard for 25 years in the National Assembly as an MNA. People support the status quo. Well, people will say, well, they don't talk about this in my riding. We're not changing the voting system. First and foremost, to increase the voter turnout rate, because the voter turnout rate can vary depending on the political conjuncture, depending on national and international events that can bring people out to vote and mobilize, depending on the leadership of people who are in power. That's not why we're changing the voting system. We're changing it because, with respect to representation, do you believe, yes or no, in democratic representation? What does it mean to you? If a political party receives 39% of the vote and governs a country like Canada, wouldn't it be better to form a coalition with another party to make a majority and to have that political majority represent a popular majority as well? Mr. Broadbent gave examples, and we can talk about, you can apply the situation in Quebec to everywhere. The problem is underrepresentation. The problem is a lack of representation, and that is very serious in a representative democracy. People who represent 10 or 15% can have 1 or 2 MP, and that's much more serious than increasing the participation rate by 1 or 2%. My question is not that. Since the beginning, it has been inferred that changing the voting system will favor minorities and young people and Aboriginal people to vote, and that there will be more people interested by politics who will get out to vote. What I would like to know, and I would like to hear the 3 witnesses on this, and it will confirm what I'm thinking. When I look at the statistics from places where they changed the voting system, the percentage of popular vote did not increase. I just gave you the answer, and I know that it's not what you want to hear. That's not what's important. And even if it had decreased the popular vote, that's not what's important. It's representation that's important. It's perfect. So what you're saying? Just one moment, please, Mr. Broadbent, and then I will let you speak with pleasure. So between the choice of a greater number of voters versus better representation, you think that better representation, well, and I'm not judging what you think about this, you think that greater representation is more important than higher turnout. Yes. And when you say that, in any case, we're at 5 minutes and we need to move on to Ms. Romanado.
Parfait, merci beaucoup. Donc, je veux remercier tous.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all of our witnesses today. Mr. Broadbent.
Service to the military and years in Parliament. Mr. Charbonneau, votre service en tant que.
And Mr. Charbonneau, your work as an MNA as well.
Something that we haven't talked about today. Mr. Broadbent, in the report that my colleague mentioned, he had mentioned the ballot is simple and easy to understand. It's something that 55% of respondents said were important to them. Given that some folks still think that when they go to the ballot box, they're voting for their Prime Minister, how important is education going to be throughout this change process? Because herding cats is not easy. So, and dans le cas de Québec, on a eu beaucoup de difficultés parce que.
It's been very difficult in Quebec because people weren't really familiar with the issues.
Educating what we should be doing, who should be doing what in terms of this process. Merci.
Well, let me begin with agreeing with you implicitly in what you're asking about the importance of education. And if I recall correctly, and I think I do, the outgoing head of the Electoral Commission had objected because the budget had, please, I'm turning to some MPs now, had been cut, I think, about that allowed him to do more education of the public. In any case, I think I'm right on that. But the point is that I think that is a very important thing that should be done, particularly if we're introducing a new system. That having been said, I again agree with you. A lot of people, before they go to the ballot box, somehow think the Prime Minister's name is going to be on there, or potential Prime Ministers, rather than their local MPs. So you have that confused. But I actually believe, having been an MP myself for many years, it's a small minority that have that problem. Most adults understand that they're voting for a party and if that party gets most of the seats, that individual is likely to be head of it, is likely to be Prime Minister. But in the new system, if there is a new system, and I certainly hope there is, I think that the Elections Canada has to have a good budget to explain this in a non-partisan way, obviously, and the political parties. I would really hope that a report will come out of here that hasn't a consensus, that the parties, hopefully all parties, but certainly a majority of parties at least, support, and that I would like to see them campaigning on this issue together, just for once, you know, if they reach a consensus on an electoral system, to be able to campaign together to explain the system. So the MPs will have a role in explaining, their constituency associations, Fair Vote Canada, and, you know, civil society organizations, and Elections Canada. But I think it all should be done.
Monsieur Charbonneau?
Ben, écoutez, je peux...
Mr. Charbonneau. Well, I've often been mixed up with the Speaker of the House of Commons. People would often ask me, aren't you the former Speaker of the House of Commons? And I've been forced to enlighten them as to the fact that there are two levels of government, and there's also the National Assembly. In 2002-2003, the report of the Bélan Commission, with non-partisan Canadians from all walks of life, one of the recommendations was to increase Canadians' civic education levels. Not just for young people, but also for adults. When you look at the number of adults who are semi-illiterate or have a hard time operating in society, we realize we have a lot of catching up to do. You've had Professor Milner appearing before you. He wrote a book around that time, in the early 2000s, called Civic Competence. And he made a comparison between our country, between Canada, and many countries in Northern Europe. And the conclusions were clear. Here, the level of civic responsibility is quite low compared to what it ought to be in a country with our way of life. We do need to ensure that Canadians are more educated. And even if we don't have a referendum, I don't think that we should avoid explaining what the changes will be to Canadians. And it will be easier for Canadians to understand what's happening if there were a political consensus. If there were the broadest possible consensus here and in the House of Commons, that would reassure Canadians. It would reassure Canadians to see that all of the parties agree. Thank you. We understand, Mr. Charbonneau. Now, the second round. Monsieur Ducourcy.
My questions to Professor Dawood this round, or at least start there. Back to the idea of democratic legitimacy, and you've mentioned some of the aspects that you think might be important. Is there a process, or are there lessons that you can leave us with during our citizen consultation process that we'll undertake here in a few weeks that would help enhance the legitimacy of this conversation and of this process?
So first of all, I think it's excellent that the committee is consulting broadly with Canadians from all parts of the country. I think that's very commendable and stands in some considerable contrast to what we saw with the Fair Elections Act. So I do think that it's very important that Canadians feel that there is a voice for them in this process. I suppose one thing that would be helpful would be some kind of centralizing mechanism to find out what exactly people think. I think that Given the number of town halls that are being held, given the dispersion of conversations, it's not always clear what people are saying or thinking. I don't know whether the committee has considered how to aggregate this information or make it available so that we can all benefit from it.
Thank you very much. Now back to the idea of potential constitutional limits, and you talked about arguments for limiting Parliament's ability to make change and arguments against. I wonder, are there any specific changes or things that we should be careful about interfering within certain constitutional limits, like potentially increasing number of seats or seat distribution or the way that constituencies are represented? Where could the line be or potentially be when considering system changes?
So certainly there are constitutional rules around provincial distribution, representational distribution, and those would have to be respected and those would have to be met. But I don't think it would be, I think most of the common proposals that are floating around would in fact not violate those distributional principles, provided that they were in fact taken into account, which I assume they would be. The other kinds of constitutional limits include making sure that you provide effective representation and meaningful participation. Those are standards that the Supreme Court has outlined in its case law. And again, I think that most of your standard proposals for reform would in fact meet those constitutional standards as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. De Courcy. Mr. Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I return to Dr. Broadbent for my questions. Forgive me for saying so. Certainly there is no harm in one changing one's mind over the course of the 12 years that passed since you made your comments and quoted John Stuart Mill.
He changed his mind, too.
Ralph Waldo. Well, that may explain why you quoted him saying two opposite things. I can't see how one can change my mind about one can change one's mind about factual statements regarding the opinions of authority figures. 12 years ago, you cited referenda and said this meets with his values. Now you say, in this committee, his values lie elsewhere. And while your opinions may have changed, I submit that, in fact, his record is unchangeable due to the fact that he's dead. And that seems a bit unfair. I noticed back 12 years ago you also, and here you were quoting, I'm quoting from an article you wrote in Policy Options, you also indicated that what you thought was the best system was, and I'm quoting, a citizen-created referendum question, and you based that on the Citizens' Assembly model in British Columbia. So now we have this idea that somehow broad consultations through or a deliberative process is an alternative to getting the people signing off, whereas with British Columbia, that was seen as being a first step in a two-stage process, something that I thought was a good idea, and you did too back then. But I wanted to actually ask you about this. You said referenda are divisive, and to make your point, you cited the Brexit referendum. I would just point out to you that if we're trying to make valid analogies here, the analogy would be the British government making the decision to exit the European Union without bothering to consult the people. Because in fact, we're talking about the government not having a referendum and deciding to change our electoral system, as if the Conservative government in Britain had decided to exit the EU without consulting the people. That would have been illegitimate. You say that referenda are divisive, and I look back at our 3 referenda in Canada, and I see a different story. In 1992, an issue which was on the verge of breaking the country apart, the failure of the Meat-Schleich Accord and the fallout of it, was resolved via a referendum in which Quebecers and a majority in the rest of the country voted against that new proposal. It seems that's preferable to a government pushing it through just because it had the support of a majority of parties, all the parties, in fact, at the time. In 1942, we had a plebiscite on conscription. And while that revealed a deep division, it let us deal with that division. I think that is preferable to the introduction of conscription without a referendum in 1917 and the riots that produced in Quebec City and elsewhere, especially Quebec City. In 1898, we had a referendum on whether the federal government should prohibit alcohol, and that revealed a deep division. Quebec was against it and the rest of the country in favor. And the result was to let this be dealt with by by provincial governments. So if there are divisions, surely a referendum, an advisory referendum, which is the only kind we have in Canada, reveals the problem. Is that not preferable to pushing through an electoral system that may or may not actually have the support of the people, with no way of demonstrating other than polls whether they support it, and pushing it through regardless of whether the polls say they support it, just because in the last election a number of the parties indicated that they thought electoral reform, not a specific form reform, just electoral reform in general, was a good idea?
Well, to use your own words, if it was a matter of pushing through an option, I would agree with you. But we've had earlier discussion, including our academic colleague from Toronto, who laid out certain conditions of legitimacy that did not entail a referendum, and arguments which I support. And my disagreement about referendum is not sort of black and white. I can see, and I'm sure I said that earlier this afternoon, I can see the arguments for a referendum, that there just happen to be arguments that I think are weaker and are not required under the present circumstance. We don't need a referendum to have legitimacy. We brought the vote, I mean historically in Parliament, for women without a referendum. That's, to say the least, that was a major change in the electoral system.
You may recall that was brought through so that only certain women could vote. I would argue that was actually done illegitimately. Later on, in 1918, after an election had been conducted where only some women who were elected to vote for the government were able to cast ballots, then it was updated. I'm always puzzled by the use of that particular example.
Well, the point is a major decision on the issue of gender equality, forget the precise details, was made without a referendum, as was bringing the vote for Indigenous Canadians, as was the vote for Japanese Canadians, and other discriminated groups. We've made major decisions, the parliamentary system, without referendums before. And I think as long as the conditions of deliberation, consultation, looking at evidence, consensus building are all done by this committee, that's the better route. I'm not saying that those who are arguing for a referendum are totally wrong. I'm just saying that there are two arguments, two different sets of propositions you can put forward for dealing with this change, and I happen to be rather strongly now on the side of one of those as opposed to the other.
Merci. Thank you, Monsieur Boulris.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Before asking my questions, I would just like to remind everyone that the previous conservative government changed election law and made the entire voting process more opaque and difficult, and there was never any question of a referendum. Mr. Charbonneau, I would just like to reassure you that we indeed take our work here very, very seriously. Our Liberal government has committed to changing the electoral system. The NDP agrees strongly with that because it's fairer for Canadians. So our role in this committee is to display leadership and to issue proposals for changing the system. The Conservative Party is defending the status quo, but political parties around this table who support changing the system represent 63% of the electorate. Mr. Broadbent, and I'll come back to you, Mr. Charbonneau, afterward. Mr. Broadbent, Canada has a Westminster-type political system. There are very few first-past-the-post systems in the world at this point because of the various distortions. But the original Westminster system is in the United Kingdom, and there have been major changes there, like in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, and they've always used a mixed member proportional system when making those major changes. That was even a condition of the Northern Irish independence, so that there would be a system with more compromise and coalitions. How would you suggest that we could imitate those examples in the United Kingdom?
Merci. That I learned from my experience as an MP the importance of having a single member elected for a certain area. And so when we deal with what I would call the democratic issue, which leads inevitably to some form of PR, where every vote counts equally, then we combine the way. And I think this is good in any political institution. If I may say to my conservative colleagues, I'm a conservative when it comes to institutional practice, that by and large, you don't go around changing things just on a whim. And when you do change things, you build on institutional structures that are there. So the structure that I like is about having individual MPs. What I don't like is the first past the post system that totally distorts the democratic will. So if we can keep the practice of having our individual MPs and then add to it a system of PR, then I think we have the best of all possible worlds. And if I may say in this context, in the post-war settlement in Germany, that system in effect was imposed on Germany, but by the people who won the war, thank God, but also became very profound in its impact in German society now. And it's a very peaceful, profoundly democratic society, but it is one that I think we can learn from. Anyway, that structure that first emerged there and then was picked up, in not necessarily in this order, in New Zealand and Scotland and Wales and so on. I think that the combination, I'm repeating myself and I'm going to shut up, the combination of first past the post and the PR is exactly what we need. And I wish my conservative colleagues agreed, but,
Alors maintenant, oui, il vous reste quand même une minute.
OK, bon.
You still have a minute left. Okay, thank you. Mr. Charbonneau, in the 2015 election campaign, when you look at the number of MPs elected, and it was the Broadbent Institute that published these statistics, on average, it took 37,700 votes for each Liberal MP, and for the Conservatives, 78,000 for the NDP, and 62,000 for the Green Party. So a gradually increasing number. And that shows that it's not a fair system. And we've seen in various situations in the province of Quebec that the popular vote was completely overturned by the results of the elections. Is this healthy for our democracy? No, it's unhealthy for our democracy. It's unhealthy for our democracy. In 1972, René Lévesque published an article where he said that this was extremely unhealthy for our democracy. And I think it's a real test. We can see to what extent the Canadians and our government representatives care about the principle of representative democracy. If some parties and some MPs don't care about it, we're better off knowing that right off the bat. I believe this is a crucial debate. It's about the type of society we want to live in. Democracy is not about majority rule. Democracy means that each citizen should be able to have his or her voice heard. Now I have a question for Mr. Charbonneau. After what happened in Quebec, when the province attempted to change the electoral system, and I also would like to address my questions to the other witnesses. We're having witnesses appear here in Ottawa. All MPs are carrying out hearings in their ridings. We're also going to travel throughout Canada in a few weeks. And the Chief Electoral Officer has said that we need to have passed any legislation by May, because if not, we won't be able to implement the changes by the next elections. Is this realistic? Well, it depends how far you want to go.
What is unrealistic is to be in Quebec and to have, well, you need to have all kinds of ways of doing the referendum. One thing that remains is to demonstrate that you were able to achieve a compromise, because if you don't, you've just demonstrated that political compromises are difficult in our system because it is a confrontational system. That means that at a certain moment, if a majority of MPs are publicly able to choose a mechanism based on the principles we were talking about earlier and based on a certain number of basic values related to democracy, I believe that you can achieve it at something surprisingly quickly. I think that Canadians would be happy and they would be proud. And as a Quebec sovereigntist, I will congratulate Mr. Trudeau if he is able to propose change, because what we need is not just election promises. We need election follow-up, and we need deliverables. And people will appreciate that, and that will cause voters to appreciate their elected officials. Mr. Broadbent.
And listening to my learned friend with such attention, I forget the
Est-ce que les délais serrés sont réalistes?
Is the tight deadline realistic?
The officials have indicated that if the report is in by the time at the end of this calendar year, that there will be time to implement a new system. And I respect their expertise, and so I think the committee should be comfortable in making a recommendation as long as it gets in by the end of this calendar year.
Madame Daywood?
Ms. Daywood, and your thoughts?
I think part of it depends on what exactly happens in the next few months as to whether or not it's realistic. So if it's the case that the process can fully vet and fully reach as many Canadians as possible, then that's one way of thinking about realistic. In terms of democratic legitimacy, I think that raises some concerns, however, as to whether the perception will be that this is a process that has been too accelerated in terms of not perhaps reaching every person or not considering all the options. Again, these are hard questions to answer. Perception is obviously in the eye of the beholder. But I think that if there is an artificial timeline, I would be less in favor of that. I think it's better to get it right and to make sure that the process is inclusive and deliberative rather than trying to race towards some predetermined deadline.
Merci. Monsieur Charbonneau, tantôt vous parliez...
Thank you, Mr. Charbonneau. Earlier you mentioned Germany that has a 50-50 list system. Would that be the ratio that you would favor? What we were looking at in Quebec was 60-40. So that's the Scottish model. A majority of MPs would be elected under the current system, and 40% would allow for the compensation for distortions under the current model. And the Chief Electoral Officer studied the feasibility of that, and he drew the conclusion that that percentage of 60-40 was a good one. That would allow us to decrease distortions and ensure, as I said earlier, that there would be a transition from a system that they know. Because we can't just reinvent the wheel. And you would share the same ratios for Canada, or you would need to do a study on that as well? Quickly, please. I think we could easily adapt the situation to Canada, and the Chief Electoral Officer of Quebec said that as well, and I think you could ask that question of the Chief Electoral Officer in Canada as well, Ms. May.
Professor Dawood, and pursue these questions of legitimacy. And you mentioned that some of the mechanisms that you think would add additional legitimacy include a citizens' assembly or additional studies, commission. And what I wanted to ask you is, given that, I mean, we talk about timelines and artificial rushing to a deadline to change our electoral system, we've had a lot of stops and starts in pursuit of electoral reform, and I think it has to do with the very narrow window of political interest over the years. You know, so you'll get a political party that says, okay, we're ready to look at this, often with less enthusiasm, as Mr. Broadbent just reflected, once they've gained power. Our first electoral commission, first time that a parliamentary committee met to look at getting rid of first past the post and replacing it with proportional representation was 1921. We've had a number of parliamentary committees since then, Mr. Reid and Mr. Broadbent looking back 12 years ago, but we've also had citizens' assemblies in Ontario and in BC, and most recently the 2004 Law Commission report. None of these efforts to pursue an investigation into electoral reform have ever recommended that we should keep our current system. Some have come to no conclusion. Most have recommended some form of proportional representation. Does that, in your view, add anything to the issue of legitimacy that we have historical efforts and some very recent historical efforts within Canada?
I think it certainly does, and it would be important, I think, for the committee to really flesh those prior processes out in whatever report comes out. So the 2004 Law Commission report, any other kind of report to back up whatever results or whatever recommendations the committee makes.
Another idea that has come to us from some other witnesses, and it's not getting a lot of discussion here around the table, but I raise it now and then because I'm interested in, and I'll ask Mr. Broadbent as well, and Mr. Charbonneau, if the committee's report, we know the committee's report goes into to Minister Monsef, then there'll be some discussion in Cabinet. The plan is to have legislation before us by spring 2017 to meet the deadline that Mr. Mayram thinks is important. As an extra element of legitimacy, do you think there'd be a possibility of having the vote in Parliament be a supermajority, more than a bare majority of the MPs in the House? Would that add to legitimacy in your view? And that's to you, Professor Dawitt. And then I'll ask Mr. Broadbent.
Oh, sorry. I thought it was to
sorry, I was
Mr.
going to ask
Broadbent.
you first,
I think it would. Okay. I think it would add to the legitimacy, certainly. I don't know that I'd make it a mandatory rule. I don't know if I'd make that a requirement. But if it were the case that you were able to secure a supermajority or, a significant majority, I certainly think that would add to the democratic legitimacy of the vote.
Thank you. And I will also ask Mr. Charbonneau et puis Mr. Broadbent. So we'll go to Mr. Charbonneau first.
Rapidement, Madame May.
Very quickly, Ms. May. I think that if a parliamentary majority rests on a popular majority, the greater the popular majority behind the majority, the greater the majority will be valid.
Of having a more than a bare majority of Parliament vote for some form of proportional representation?
As has already been said, I think it would add, obviously, to the legitimacy, but I don't think it's required. I think what is required is that more than one party, and I'd love to hear our Liberal colleagues comment on this, whether they agree that just a measure brought in by the governing Liberal Party alone, that would not be legitimate. But what would be legitimate if a motion came in and it had the support of a majority in the House of Commons as reflecting the votes, the seats they got in government in the general election, the last election. I think that's sufficient legitimacy, i.e. a straight majority vote in the House of Commons with more than one party represented.
The second question I have for you, Mr. Broadbent, is one that's come to us from Twitter. Laurel Russworm wonders why you've settled on mixed member proportional if your concern is to make sure you have an MP that you know you voted for. And her question is, doesn't single transferable vote also provide for that required local representation?
Well, it does so, but I just have a preference for simplicity's sake of a mixed member. You go in and you cast two votes. You cast a vote for your local member, and you cast a vote for the party. But like, as I was trying to say to my reply to Mr. Reid, most of these issues are not black and white. There are plausible arguments on both sides, as there are in response to the question you just asked.
Thank you.
Si vous juste...
Non, on a vraiment à 5 minutes. Je m'excuse.
I'm sorry, he's reached his 5 minutes. I'm sorry, Mr. Charbonneau, I'm the chair. I understand, Mr. Chair. I respect your authority. You can always come back to it later when you are speaking later. Thank you very much.
A bit about gaining more legitimacy depending on what we do from this week in the next 3 months, exactly. So in the next 3 months, you know that for about 3 weeks of it, we're going to be hitting the road and going across Canada consulting with Canadians. we may be discussing this a little bit later on today, I'm not sure, but what type of format would you advise that we take when we're consulting with Canadians? Should we just be listening to their opinions? Should we be doing some kind of workshops? Should we be engaging in a certain way with them? Do you have any opinions on that?
Are you asking me?
Yes, Professor Hayward.
Okay. So I think one of the challenges with trying to come up with a substantive proposal is that you've got both advantages and disadvantages for every electoral system, right? So they all involve trade-offs of various kinds. So I think it would be helpful, and trade-offs in terms of values and outcomes and so on. So I think it would be helpful to get a sense from Canadians as to what kinds of things they would prioritize over others, depending on the kind of electoral system that's chosen. So that's always, I think, the harder kind of question is, it's not that they're all bad systems, it's just that some systems do a better job at certain things than other things. So it'd be helpful to know, what do Canadians care about? Which of those values would they prioritize over others?
My next question goes to Mr. Broadbent. I guess one of the values that you prioritize is fairness and having every vote count. In the mixed system that you prefer, you would have first past the post for the local representative. So in fact, in that system, does every vote technically count? Because you would still have strategic voting. You would still have someone elected against, the popular local vote in that area. You wouldn't avoid some things.
As I said, in these questions, and it's obvious, I think, in the whole discussion, it's not a black and white. These are their advantages and disadvantages, and one of the advantages for me in retaining first past the post at the local level, as long as it's profoundly affected by PR, is that for Canadians to accept the new system without too many changes, that would be more readily the case. They're accustomed to electing their local MP by a certain traditional method. But you could also have at that level a preferential vote for the local MP as well. And some people would favor that as being more quote-unquote democratic, and I can see the argument for that. But I, for one, could accept either approach for electing the local MP.
My next question is for Mr. Cherbout. You had mentioned that we shouldn't just have a majority agreement in Parliament if it came to a vote in Parliament, that we should also have the popular vote. So how exactly would we calculate that? Would we go back to figuring out which MP got how much of the vote in their riding and then figure out from there whether we had the popular vote? Or is there another?
Inaudible for the interpreter. Microphone, please. If your parties obtained popular support that is identifiable, and if this popular support is calculated by multiplying by the number of parties that would have an alliance, then finally you would have a statement of the percentage of the population represented in Parliament, and they would choose and support through their political representation, because once again, you don't govern by referendum every day. On some major issues, there needs to be a referendum, and we saw earlier there is a series of major files that did not require a referendum, and that didn't morally concern political leaders and cause them to ask themselves whether they had political legitimacy or not. They were using their parliamentary majority. What is more illegitimate, governing with a minority of the population and a majority of MPs, or obtaining consensus? I think in the current context, well, for example, the current preferential ballot proposal, well, the main issue is that between a preferential ballot and a mixed member proportional system with compensation, which of the two systems would achieve the principle of better representation, political representation for citizens? And that's what's important. There is no perfect system. There are principles on which we must base ourselves.
Professor Daywood, I've got a question or two for you in this round. You had mentioned in your opening remarks, talking about consulting with citizens or hearing from citizens in this process, and you talked about the town halls that are being conducted and how you wouldn't see them as providing the certainly the degree of consultation or legitimacy that. And you mentioned a few other options, things like a referendum, things like a citizens' assembly, some kind of a commission that involves citizens. You mentioned all those as other options that would certainly, meet that test at a far greater level. And I think when we look at these town hall meetings that have been taking place, I mean, there's been a number of issues that have developed, I guess, at them that would, lead people to question them to some degree, I would think. First of all, there was a town hall that was being held where there was published on the Liberal website where they were asking for an admission fee to be charged and paid to the Liberal Party to get into one of them. Now,
well, I don't know. That was.
Mr. Chair.
That was not. I don't think that was an MP.
Mr. Chair, is the floor not mine?
Well, I'd like to just. I think I'd like to answer that because my understanding is
Mr.
it wasn't.
Chair,
Mr. Richard, I have precedence at this moment. I'd like to. I would just like to clarify a point. Is I don't think that was a town hall.
Chair, but
pardon me?
I said I didn't realize we were here to debate issues.
No, I'm not debating. I just want to clarify something.
Sounds like it, Mr. Chair.
It was not, and for the witnesses as well, it was not a town hall. And my understanding is it was not a town hall within the context of the invitation we sent to the 338 MPs. That's all I have to say about that.
Well, my understanding is that there was certainly a town hall being held, and it was a admission fee being charged. Now, to the Liberal Party's credit, when that attention was drawn to it, they did pull the ad from their website. Subsequent to that, we've had reports of people being turned away from town halls because they weren't pre-registered. We had an opinion piece appear in the Vancouver Sun, and I'm not going to name the MP because I don't feel that I want to make this personal in any way. But there was a piece that indicated that the member was asked. It was about a town hall that was held obviously in that area, and it indicated that the majority of the people that had spoken during the open mic portion had been in favor of having a referendum before any changes. And then it went on to indicate that the member was asked repeatedly by speakers if he would go back to the Prime Minister and tell him the people of his riding think they should be consulted by referendum before our electoral system, which has served us well for centuries, is overturned and replaced by something else. And then he goes on to say we didn't get an answer. So there's been a number of things, and I could point to others, but we only have so much time that sort of would call these into question to some degree. And then, of course, you stated in your opening remarks, Professor Daywood, that electoral reform differs from the passage of ordinary legislation because it changes the very ground rules by which political power is attained. The electoral reform process must therefore be held to a higher standard of democratic legitimacy. You also had indicated in a paper that you wrote for McGill Law Journal, and a quote here again, if it were possible for the government to unilaterally reform democratic institutions, then it could unilaterally reform them in an anti-democratic direction as well. And then in a paper that you wrote, an editorial, I guess, for policy options earlier this year, you said, and I quote, a change to the electoral system should not be simply pushed through by whichever political party happens to have a majority. So this all is to make the point that, obviously, you had indicated this as well, that there needs to be something that involves the citizens beyond just simply, a majority party in Parliament deciding to push through a change. I guess my question would be, first of all, do you believe that that's an important value that must involve citizens in some way beyond just this town hall process, beyond simply just a number of politicians are proposing some option, and is that something you would agree with, that the citizens need to be involved in this process in some way, whether it be a referendum, whether it be a citizens' assembly, whatever it might be?
Okay, so I guess I should clarify that in all the research that you cited, the point I was making that there must be a number of items, and I'll turn to citizens in a moment, but the bigger point was that it's much better if there's consensus among the political parties. So it can't just be the majority party, whatever that party happens to be at any given moment, pushing through major reforms. And a lot of the writing that you cited was actually in reference to the Fair Elections Act that the previous government tried to and did in fact push through. So yes, the ideal process to my mind is one that involves everybody. So all the political parties have a say. Elections Canada has a say. Citizens are consulted, and they also are involved in the process, as are other kinds of groups and interests in the process. So I don't. Again, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, I don't think there's any single process that's mandated. It's much more of a contextual analysis in terms of whether it is democratically legitimate in terms of those three norms, which is nonpartisanship, consultation, and deliberation. So I don't think there's any one thing that must occur for the process to be democratically legitimate as a whole.
Thank you. So I didn't take any, you didn't lose any time because of my intervention.
Okay.
And I even gave you a bit of extra time. Just
okay. Okay. So
just to make up for the inconvenience of my intervention. But we have to go now to Mr. Aldag.
Fair enough.
I'm going to go to Dr. Broadbent and question, then we'll come back because earlier you hadn't had a chance to speak to my statements, just exploring values, and I would like your thoughts on that if you have anything that you did want to share. But in your written brief, you had identified a number of issues that you felt a proportional representation system would address, including things like the underrepresentation of women or visible minorities, increasing participation. And I agree, like, there are systems that would be designed, or in their design would help with some of that. But, it also seems that there would be other means, it could be quota systems for nominations under the current system, or there are other fixes that are available. And so I'd just like your thoughts on, specifically on, if there I've completely lost my train of thought here for a sec. Have to read my notes. Just thoughts on if proportional representation is the only way to address some of these issues that you've identified. So maybe a comment or two on that, and then if you have anything on values and values that we should be looking at, I'd appreciate hearing from you on those.
Well, I don't want to bore the committee with repetition of what I've already said or what's in the brief about the values that are outlined in our own brief and from Professor Daywood, that I agree with these as underlying values that should be respected. And I also agree with the comment that you can't cherry pick out of them and say, well, this one is absolutely essential, or that one is. It's a combination of a mix, and you're not going to get them all at the same time, is simply what I would say. But if you will permit me, and I know this is to turn the tables, and I can understand if you wouldn't answer, one of the points that has really been made is that whatever is done in terms of bringing in a new system, that the governing party should not act alone on this. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would say that the fact that we're at this committee and the structure that's been given to it, where we listen to what message we were hearing from Canadians and from our colleagues, that we shouldn't have a majority at the table. This committee's been structured in such a way that we don't. I think that's a very...
But the government, excuse me, the government can still, whatever this committee recommends...
In fairness...
I can't speak for the...
In fairness, the questions should come from the witnesses, but I allowed.
It's an informal discussion.
Well, it's actually it's a formal hearing of a special committee, but I did, Mr. Broadbent, out of great respect, I allowed the question, but I think. We'll give the floor back to Mr. Aldag.
The answer.
I did want to hear, like with Professor Daywood, The previous round of questions, you had this idea of inclusion, and I guess I'm sitting here wondering, what's enough? And we've heard that we do have a time frame that we're working towards. You'd indicated that maybe we shouldn't be sticking with this arbitrary deadline, and yet to meet the deadlines or the time frames that we're working toward, we need to keep things moving on. And so, we are doing a number of hearings. Every member of Parliament has been invited to do town halls, recognizing that they're not flawless in their delivery. Every Canadian has actually been asked to provide input if they want to through online consultations. That the website is open, and so every Canadian has the opportunity right now. From a process perspective, what else is needed? Are we?
So I think that's.
Are we on a legitimate path here? Because it seems like we're doing a lot. And from your perspective, what else is needed?
So I think it would depend on the deliberations of this committee. So if it's the case that at the end of your deliberations you do reach a consensus, so let's say everyone does agree to a particular proposal and everyone has signed on, and you have in fact reached as many witnesses and as many Canadians as possible, then that might, as you say, be enough. If, however, you don't reach a consensus on the committee, then it might make sense to, this is just an idea, throwing in an idea, that the recommendation might be something like, there are two options that need to be further looked into, and that's our recommendation, that we narrow it down to these two, and then set up some sort of commission that will actually look more deeply into the two options and then make a recommendation. So then you would extend the process slightly if there isn't consensus. If it's the case that you have most of the political parties on the special committee in agreement, I think, again, that would be a good sign. If you have in the legislative arena the majority of the popular vote on side, again, I think that would be quote unquote enough. So there's not one answer. It really depends on what this committee comes to decide in the next few months and the number of parties that are in agreement.
Thank you. Mr. Cullen.
Just getting through some Twitter, and it was asked, not so much a question from someone watching the committee, but a seeking of comment on an essay that I'm now reading as well called Our Benign Dictatorship, that was penned by Mr. Flanagan and Mr. Harper some years ago. And I'll read you just one quote, and perhaps that we can get a comment from that. Although we like to think of ourselves as living in a mature democracy, we live instead in something little better than a benign dictatorship, not under a strict one-party rule, but under a one-party plus system beset by factionalism, regionalism, and cronyism that accompany any such system. That was Mr. Harper in the mid-late 90s, before the system worked for him, and he didn't maybe feel that way. There's also a suggestion on Twitter that every time my Conservative colleagues say referendum, people should drink, and I think that's a bad idea for everybody involved. The question I put to you is this: not only that was a moment in time for our most recent Prime Minister who felt that way about our system, leading to what he called a benign dictatorship. It seems to require three things that we need right now: the courage to see this reform through from the current government, the principle not to rig the new system in their favor, and also the humility from all of us, and I hear this from Mr. Charbonneau, the responsibility to seek compromise and find something, as Professor Daoust has said, would greatly enrich the legitimacy of what this committee comes to. Has anything I've said, or even the quote from Mr. Harper and Mr. Flanagan, struck you as wrong? I'll start with Mr. Broadbent and then head to Mr. Charbonneau.
Let me pick up on the dictatorial aspect of it. There have been in academic literature, in what's been going on since World War II, about the parliamentary system, increasing centralization into the office of the Prime Minister in our system, not just in Canada, but in the UK and elsewhere in the Commonwealth. Our system does lend itself, especially with first past the post and the kind of belligerent politics, frankly, the Westminster model sets, with the government on one side, the opposition on the other, as opposed to the concave or the kind of structure that other democratic systems have, where you may sit together side by side instead of in opposition. the point I'm getting at is that the point made by Mr. Harper, I think I'm inclined to agree with its poetic exaggeration of dictatorship, because we have many other principles, the Charter of Rights and so on. But in terms of exercising political will, we do have that. The Prime Minister in our system has excessive power, and one of the advantages of electoral reform of the kind that most people who have appeared before this committee have advocated, I have advocated, Mr. Charbonneau has advocated, is we'll get to a more consensual form of politics, and the Prime Minister, frankly, won't have the same direct power. He or she will have to deal in a consensus-building way, likely with at least one other party to govern. And that will reduce, and that's in that same article, but the one I remember reading by Mr. Harper and Mr. Flanagan, they advocated a form of PR. They were coming down on the side of PR.
They did.
Because it mitigates, and for other reasons too, it mitigates the centralizing power of a Prime Minister. And I think that is desirable. And I add what I said before. I hope the present Prime Minister, I praised him for this initiative, and I hope he sees the implications of really following through with the kind of consensual form of government that could emerge from recommendation by this committee that would reduce the over-centralizing power that goes to our Prime Minister in the present system.
Mr. Sharman.
In my opinion, one of the main issues here is changing political culture. If you manage that, we will not be in this adversarial situation that we currently are. There won't be as much partisanship. Everyone will benefit from that. The British parliamentary system came into being after multiple abuses of power by the king, who had wielded absolute power for centuries. Then the parliamentary system came into being. From that day on, the king was nothing more than window dressing. It was now the Prime Minister who held power. The Prime Minister who was the leader of the party with the most MPs. And yet, we've somehow found our way into an elected monarchy once again. Is it not abuse of power to govern with a minority of popular support? And, in addition, to use parliamentary mechanisms like muzzling MPs, ending debate, imposing time allocation, and all this by individuals who don't even have the legitimacy of popular support. Ms. Dewood, we're talking about the legitimacy of the process. And we're hearing a lot about the fact that as soon as another political party decides to support the government, there will be a broader support, over 50%, like Mr. Charbonneau said, and that would give more legitimacy to the process. But in my opinion, that logic, well, in my opinion, there is a shortcut. In my opinion, if there's two parties who decide to support electoral reform, all Canadians who voted for those parties are showing their support. Or rather, that's a shortcut that's taken by this argument, but I don't think that every single Canadian who's voted for one of these parties is showing that they support electoral reform. There are all sorts of issues. So a referendum would allow each and every Canadian to say that they agree or not with the recommendations of the committee. Or if we had a coalition of 2 or 3 parties which would give a semblance of legitimacy to this, which of those propositions do you support?
Asking whether a referendum is required, is that the question?
Non, c'est entre un référendum.
If there are two options, on the one hand, a referendum who would allow any change to have more legitimacy, since each Canadian would be able to express their opinion, would you prefer that to the idea of having 2 political parties who support electoral reform with the principle that everyone who's voted for those parties agrees with that specific element of their platform? Which of those two things do you think is more legitimate?
Is that it comes down to an option like that. It's the entire process that matters, right? So it could be the case that if you have a process that has a referendum, that would be one way of thinking about legitimacy. But as I said in my remarks, it's not required for legitimacy. In fact, my concern around referendums is that it's not politically neutral because it tends to favor the status quo, as we've seen in the provincial efforts at electoral reform for a number of reasons why referendums tend usually to fail in that way. So given that there is a tendency towards the status quo, I do not think that a referendum is a requirement. It's usually favored by people who like the status quo, for political parties who prefer for the first past the post system to remain.
Parfait. Est-ce que ça veut dire que nécessairement...
Does that mean that if we lose a referendum, does that mean that those who voted have made the wrong decision? Is it just because the politicians believe that something is a good idea? If the population makes the same choice, does that really mean it's the wrong decision? I feel that if Canadians... Please go ahead.
People who are participating in a referendum have made the wrong decision. It's more that what the research seems to show, for example, in a number of studies, that there isn't sufficient education or sufficient money put into educating people in terms of what really is at stake in the referendum. And given that, people often tend to favor the status quo. So if you had an ideal circumstance, for example, you had months of education for every single citizen, and every citizen was, you had the kind of infrastructure and the resources to make sure that every single person was fully educated, and this might take a year, for example, to roll out, and then in that case, it would be, it wouldn't necessarily be always favoring the status quo. People wouldn't necessarily make that decision. However, that's just not how most referendum are organized. There's usually very little information. All the debate, for example, of this committee has occurred over the summer, which tends to be a dead time in terms of people paying attention to politics. So whatever insights have been gained at this committee aren't necessarily seeping through to Canadians. So there are a lot of issues around education and access, which makes a referendum, to my mind, not necessary, not required.
Donc,
on est arrivé à 5 minutes, monsieur.
Merci, madame.
That's the end of your time.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding some of your recommendations. So in an MMP system, we would have a local level MP that was voted directly by the constituents. And Mr. Broadbent, you mentioned it could perhaps be a preferential vote for that specific position. And then there would be the regional MP. So I'd like to get a sense of what that would look like in terms of implementation. For instance, would that require redrawing boundary electoral districts? Would that require increasing the number of MPs or decreasing the number of MPs? So I'm not sure how it would be played out and the complexity to do that. So if I could have both your expertise, Monsieur Charbonneau aussi, on what it would look like.
First of all, I think it could exist without changing the boundaries, but I don't think that would be preferable from my point of view. I think that some modification in the boundaries for individual MPs would probably be desirable, but not necessary. And then you have the regional component. It depends on the split, as mentioned earlier. If you have a 60-40 split between MPs and the regional representation, that could lead to one kind of size recommended for ridings, as opposed to if you had a 50-50 split. This could result in different size constituencies. So it is complex in the sense of getting it established and sorting it out, and that's why you really would need, I mean, when the committee sits down and looks at some options, I think to be banal and state the obvious, you should consult with some technical staff people who could guide you in some way. If you agree in certain principles like MMP, then look at the variables within that and what that would imply for constituency size and so on. So I hope that answer helps.
Si j'avais une suggestion.
If I could make a suggestion to the committee members, it's that you should read the report of the Chief Electoral Officer on the modalities of mixed compensatory voting systems from 2007. And in that report, I have the summary before me, and I think that you should have the official document, but you will read a lot of responses to the technical questions that you're asking. For example, the Quebec example, if it had worked under the opinion of the Chief Electoral Officer and the preliminary bill tabled, instead of 78, we would have had 77 ridings and 50 regional ridings. And the 50 regional ridings, 50% with regional MPs, and instead of having one list for all of Quebec, there would be 12 to 15 ridings. And that would mean that in certain regional ridings, there might be a longer list than in others, depending on the importance of the riding. And you could also try to balance the 12 to 15 ridings to ensure that the voters' power would be roughly the same and that the regions would be roughly the same. So there are different modalities. Compensation can also be used, as explained as the Chief Electoral Officer explained. In other words, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are people who have worked a great deal in universities, and there are officials in the countries that have tabled substantial reports, and they have really studied these in depth in a nonpartisan context. And I think that you should draw inspiration from that, especially if that is the model that you wish to adapt to find a consensus and develop a model. I just wanted to mention, Mr. Charbonneau, you mentioned earlier that when an MP is elected, he does the work. So he or she doesn't distinguish between regional or riding. I won with 35% of the vote. I am still doing the work for 100% of my voters, of course. And when I was elected, I was lucky. Out of the 6 elections that I won, most of them I had an absolute majority. 1 or 2 times I had 49% or so, but I was very frustrated, but I was happy to have an absolute majority. But at the same time, you need to be careful, because under the logic of the absolute majority, you can seek to favor 2 rounds. The essential component is fair representation of the voter and their opinions in Parliament, where decisions are deliberated. Thank you very much, and we will wrap up with that. I would like to thank our witnesses. Ms. Dawood, we greatly benefited from your thoughts and your research, particularly on the issue of legitimacy. And obviously, it was a great pleasure to have 2 politicians who are so well known in Canada and who shared their experiences and their wisdom on this issue with us. The committee will suspend for 5 minutes, and we will return after the suspension to sit in camera to discuss some committee business. Thank you very much. You came here in the month of August. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much. The meeting is suspended. you.